Trade, not aid. The U.S. shifts gear in Africa with a bold commercial diplomacy agenda. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa speaks and the world listens. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. In today's special report, we break down the U.S.'s bold new pivot from aid to trade in Africa. Is this a turning point or just old wine in a new bottle? Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind the headlines, analyze the global shifts, and explore what this means for Africa's future. Introduction: A paradigm shift in U.S. Africa engagement. The U.S. government has declared a radical policy pivot in its approach to Africa, moving decisively from the long established assistance driven model to a commercial diplomacy agenda. In a briefing on Tuesday, Ambassador Troy Fitrell, acting head of the U.S. State Department's Africa Bureau, announced that the Trump administration is now anchoring its Africa strategy on investment led engagement. This shift comes on the heels of sweeping cuts to USAID programs and represents a significant ideological and operational transformation in Washington's policy posture toward the continent. The message is clear: trade, not aid, is no longer a slogan. It's now official U.S. policy. Ambassadors are being evaluated not just on diplomatic finesse, but on the business deals they broker and the extent to which they create a conducive investment climate for American firms. As Fitrell declared at the 2025 Africa CEO Forum and the U.S. Business Summit in Abidjan, this new six-pronged strategy aims to energize U.S. Africa commercial relations, attract private sector capital, and catalyze local economies. Source: All Africa. Commercial Diplomacy Now. Core focus of U.S. engagement with Africa. Briefing by U.S. Ambassador Troy Fitrell, May 2025. The six-pronged strategy, breaking down the commercial agenda. The new U.S. Africa strategy rests on six core pillars. 1. Ambassadorial deal metrics. U.S. Ambassadors are now performance rated on their ability to identify, promote, and finalize business deals. This represents a departure from traditional diplomatic metrics focused on political stability and aid program management. 2. Market reform advocacy. U.S. envoys are tasked with working alongside African governments to implement key market reforms prioritized by the private sector. This puts the onus on local governments to liberalize investment laws, enforce intellectual property protections, and reform regulatory bottlenecks. 3. Infrastructure development. Focus is shifting to sustainable, high-quality infrastructure that is not just socially beneficial, but also commercially viable. This opens the door for public-private partnerships, especially in transport, logistics, energy, and telecommunications. 4. Private sector-led commercial missions. The U.S. will facilitate more frequent investment trips driven by business interests rather than bureaucratic agendas, targeting untapped opportunities in Francophone and Lusophone Africa. 5. Connection to U.S. capital markets. With over 300,000 U.S. export-ready firms and a $120 trillion capital base, the administration aims to bridge the divide between American companies and African markets, especially in SMEs and frontier sectors like fintech, green energy, and digital trade. 6. Reform of U.S. trade instruments. Structural changes are underway to revamp U.S. trade facilitation, project preparation, and investment financing tools to better serve American companies looking to expand into Africa. Quote, "We're putting it into practice with an investment-led approach that facilitates exchange between equals." Ambina Troy Fitrell. Critical Analysis, Opportunities and Risks for Africa. This shift is a double-edged sword. On one hand, Africa's private sector stands to gain unprecedented access to U.S. markets, capital, and innovation. The emphasis on commercially viable infrastructure could reduce the continent's over-reliance on China, which has dominated infrastructure financing, but has also left some nations trapped in debt cycles. On the other hand, the abrupt reduction of over $60 billion in humanitarian and development assistance by USAID poses immediate risks to fragile health systems, education programs, and food security initiatives, particularly in conflict-affected and post-crisis zones like the Sahel, Horn of Africa, and Great Lakes region. While commercial diplomacy may galvanize urban economic hubs, it risks bypassing rural and marginalized communities, which remain heavily dependent on foreign aid for basic survival. Without careful policy calibration, this strategy could widen inequality and deepen social vulnerabilities. Africa-wide comparisons, a race for influence. Africa is no stranger to investment diplomacy. China, the EU, Turkey, India, and the UAE have all embedded commercial diplomacy into their foreign policy toward the continent. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has led to the construction of ports, railways, and highways, but has raised concerns over transparency, debt sustainability, and labor practices. The European Union's Global Gateway strategy focuses on green and digital infrastructure, presenting a sustainability-oriented alternative to China's model. Turkey and the UAE have taken strategic positions in real estate, logistics, and manufacturing hubs across West and East Africa, often without the bureaucratic rigidity associated with U.S. programs. In this crowded field, the U.S. commercial diplomacy push will need more than slogans. It requires agile implementation, local partnerships, and the political will to adapt to African realities. The Lobito Corridor Project, a transnational railway connecting Angola, DRC, and Zambia, is a notable flagship initiative, but will be a litmus test for how effectively U.S. investment can compete with Chinese infrastructure financing. Forward-looking perspective, the road to Abidjan and beyond. Ambassador Fitrell's indication that a second U.S. Africa Leaders Summit is planned for late 2025 provides a potential launchpad for institutionalizing this commercial strategy. If successful, this summit could serve as a pivotal moment to cement U.S. commitment beyond political cycles. The future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, set to expire in 2025, is another critical juncture. Fitrell acknowledged the need for a modernization of AGOA to reflect today's global trade dynamics, hinting at possible reforms to include digital trade, services, and climate-oriented exports. Yet, without congressional buy-in and bipartisan support, both AGOA renewal and the broader strategy risk being derailed. The administration must therefore engage not just African partners, but also domestic political actors, U.S. investors, and civil society to ensure the sustainability of its investment-led pivot. Impact on African SMEs, unlocking or undermining potential. Small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, are the backbone of African economies, accounting for over 80% of employment and more than 50% of GDP in many countries. Yet, they remain underserved by both local capital markets and foreign investment flows. The U.S.'s new commercial diplomacy strategy, if executed inclusively, could act as a game changer for Africa's SME ecosystem. Connecting African SMEs to U.S. supply chains, export markets, and investment capital, particularly from the estimated 300,000 export-ready U.S. companies, could accelerate their growth, enhance competitiveness, and foster regional trade. This aligns with the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, which aims to reduce barriers and unify markets across 54 nations. However, there are legitimate concerns. Will the bulk of U.S. capital favor larger, foreign-led ventures that already meet international compliance standards, such as those in extractives, infrastructure, and telecommunications? Or will there be mechanisms to support SMEs with capacity building, technical assistance, and risk sharing instruments? Currently, U.S. agencies like the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA, tend to favor projects with robust financials, reducing accessibility for early stage African enterprises. Unless this policy shift includes a deliberate strategy to de risk SME investments, many local businesses may remain spectators rather than beneficiaries. Moreover, trade reform without technical support could deepen existing asymmetries. African SMEs often face hurdles in meeting U.S. sanitary standards, intellectual property regulations, and supply chain logistics. Without targeted interventions, the U.S. strategy may inadvertently reproduce the very imbalances it seeks to redress. Geopolitical dimensions, a counterweight to China or a complementary actor. The repositioning of the United States as a commercial partner rather than an aid donor also carries significant geopolitical weight. Africa has become a theater for great power competition, with China, Russia, the EU, Turkey, and Gulf states actively courting political and economic partnerships across the continent. China's model, anchored by state-directed infrastructure investment, has long prioritized speed and visibility. The Lobito Corridor, now supported by U.S. investment, is widely seen as a strategic counter to China's dominance in African logistics corridors, particularly in mineral-rich Central Africa. But Ambassador Fitrell has insisted that the U.S. is not seeking to outbid Beijing, but rather to offer a values-based, market-driven alternative. This framing positions the U.S. as a development partner that emphasizes transparent governance, rule of law, and environmental standards, a stark contrast to China's more transactional model. However, for African governments and businesses, the calculus is often pragmatic. Whoever delivers faster and cheaper gets the deal. U.S. commercial diplomacy will therefore be tested on its ability to match speed with sustainability and capital with capacity building. Voices from the continent, reactions from African leaders and civil society. Early reactions to the shift in U.S. policy have been mixed across Africa's political and civic landscape. Some governments, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, and Ghana, have welcomed the move, seeing it as a long overdue reset that treats Africa as a partner rather than a recipient. President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire praised the establishment of French-speaking investment liaison offices in Abidjan, calling it a tangible commitment to deeper economic engagement. Similarly, Ghana's Ministry of Trade has issued a statement noting its intent to work closely with the U.S. Embassy in Accra to identify priority sectors for investment partnerships. However, civil society organizations across Nigeria, Ethiopia, and the Sahel have raised alarm over the withdrawal of critical USAID funds, particularly in the health and education sectors. The Africa Health Budget Network, AHBN, has warned that without parallel investment in social sectors, commercial diplomacy alone cannot deliver inclusive growth. The U.S. cannot build roads and ignore hospitals, said Dr. Chika Ogu, a health equity advocate in Abuja. We welcome trade, but not at the expense of life-saving aid. Structural questions. Can U.S. institutions adapt to the new mandate? One of the most significant challenges ahead lies not in Africa, but within the U.S. government itself. Ambassador Fitrell's call for structural reforms to U.S. trade promotion, project preparation, and financing tools is an implicit recognition that current mechanisms are not fit for purpose in this new era. Agencies like the Export-Import Bank of the United States, EXIM, DFC, and USTDA have traditionally operated with risk-averse mandates, complex compliance frameworks, and slow disbursement timelines. These constraints limit their appeal compared to nimbler Chinese, Emirati, or Indian counterparts. If the U.S. is serious about making commercial diplomacy the core focus of its Africa policy, then it must overhaul its own bureaucratic machinery. This could include streamlining project approval timelines for African ventures, expanding concessional lending windows for infrastructure and digital projects, offering blended finance packages with local African banks and investors, increasing staffing and linguistic capacity in key African regions, especially Francophone West Africa and Lusophone Southern Africa. Moreover, Washington will need to align its private sector incentives with Africa's development priorities, such as clean energy, climate adaptation, food systems resilience, and digital innovation, sectors where U.S. technical advantage can be leveraged for public good. Looking ahead, a high-stakes summit and the battle for policy continuity. The proposed 2025 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, expected to take place in the autumn, could serve as the litmus test for this new approach. Unlike previous summits which leaned heavily on aid pledges and symbolic declarations, this one is expected to showcase deal announcements, investment pipelines, and institutional partnerships. However, there remains the elephant in the room: policy continuity. With the looming uncertainty of U.S. presidential elections, African leaders and businesses remain cautious. Will a future administration sustain this investment-led strategy or revert to an assistance-first model? Will AGOA be renewed with modern features or be left to expire in the political shuffle? These unanswered questions place significant pressure on the current administration to institutionalize its commercial diplomacy reforms swiftly and to create enduring structures that survive electoral turnover. Sector-specific opportunities, where investment could drive transformation. Under the banner of commercial diplomacy, the U.S. is signaling its intent to be more than just a trade partner. It aims to be an economic catalyst. But for this new strategy to succeed, it must go beyond mega projects and high-level diplomacy. The future hinges on sector-specific investment that aligns with Africa's demographic dynamics, development needs, and innovation potential. 1. Agriculture and agribusiness, from subsistence to scale. Africa holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet it remains a net importer of food. Investment in climate-smart agriculture, agro-processing, cold chain logistics, and digital platforms for farmers could transform the sector into a cornerstone of both food security and export-led growth. U.S. agribusiness giants and tech startups can play a pivotal role by partnering with local cooperatives to scale production, introducing mechanization and precision agriculture tools, financing post-harvest infrastructure to reduce food loss, exporting African-grown produce to global markets through AGOA or future trade agreements. The pivot to commercial diplomacy should ensure these investments empower rural economies, create jobs for youth and women, and reduce dependency on food imports. 2. Renewable energy and climate tech, powering the green transition. With over 600 million Africans lacking access to electricity, energy remains one of the continent's most pressing constraints. The U.S. has an opportunity to lead on renewable energy infrastructure, especially solar, wind, and mini-grid technologies that are scalable, climate resilient, and commercially viable. This is particularly important in the context of global decarbonization. Africa contributes less than 4% of global carbon emissions, but bears the brunt of climate change. U.S. climate tech companies can find not only ethical justification, but also economic opportunity in deploying off-grid solutions in underserved communities, partnering with local governments under green financing frameworks, supporting carbon credit generation and monetization through U.S. Africa trade instruments, investing in lithium and rare earth mineral processing to support the global energy transition. 3. Digital trade and the creative economy. Africa's youth dividend. Africa is the youngest continent with a median age of 19, and digital entrepreneurship is booming, from fintech in Kenya to Nollywood in Nigeria. Yet digital inclusion remains fragmented, with infrastructure gaps, regulatory fragmentation, and limited venture capital access. U.S. digital firms and investors can bridge this divide by supporting mobile broadband and fiber infrastructure through PPPs, investing in African tech hubs and startup accelerators, exporting African content, film, music, fashion, to global audiences, facilitating cross-border digital trade through e-commerce platforms. Moreover, U.S. partnerships in cybersecurity, e-governance, and AI ethics could position Africa as not just a consumer of technology, but a producer and thought leader in the global digital economy. 4. Health systems and pharmaceutical manufacturing. Lessons from COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed Africa's dependence on imported pharmaceuticals and fragile public health systems. U.S. firms and institutions can support Africa's health security sovereignty by co-investing in vaccine and generic drug manufacturing capacity, e.g., Institut Pasteur in Senegal, BioVac in South Africa, strengthening health supply chains and digital health records, training the next generation of healthcare workers and biomedical researchers, supporting decentralized care models and health startups. However, the contradiction between reducing health aid and promising health-related investment must be addressed with coherent policy alignment, not contradictory messaging. The role of the African diaspora, building bridges, not gaps. A major untapped opportunity in the commercial diplomacy strategy is the African diaspora, particularly in the United States, where millions of African-born and African-American citizens maintain strong cultural, familial, and economic ties to the continent. Diaspora entrepreneurs already contribute billions in annual remittances, often the largest source of external financing for some African countries. However, remittances are largely used for consumption rather than investment due to a lack of structured channels and risk-sharing tools. The U.S. government, through its new policy, can facilitate diaspora bonds and investment platforms, support diaspora-led startups through export credits and grants, create formal avenues for diaspora engagement in trade missions, policy design, and summit discussions, build educational and cultural exchange programs to deepen long-term engagement. Commercial diplomacy that fails to integrate diaspora voices will miss a powerful engine for innovation, trust building, and local knowledge. Conversely, a strategy that elevates diaspora capital and expertise could become the most sustainable pillar of U.S. Africa economic relations. Challenges of implementation, from high-level vision to local impact. Despite the ambitious tone of the new strategy, many observers remain cautious. History is replete with grand U.S. initiatives that failed to translate from policy papers to grassroots transformation, from the Millennium Challenge account to Power Africa. Key challenges include policy coherence, balancing commercial diplomacy with humanitarian obligations, institutional readiness, reforming U.S. agencies to work faster and more flexibly, African buy-in, ensuring that African governments lead the agenda rather than react to it, measurement, defining success beyond number of deals by tracking job creation, local ownership, and inclusion sustainability, shielding the policy from political turnover, both in Washington and in African capitals. Without a solid implementation framework and strong local partnerships, commercial diplomacy risks becoming commercial rhetoric, with little real impact on poverty, inequality, or structural transformation. AGOA reform, from legacy tool to modern trade framework. At the heart of the U.S. Africa trade relationship lies the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, a 25-year-old preferential trade framework granting eligible African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of products. While AGOA has facilitated billions in exports and created countless jobs, particularly in textiles, apparel, and agriculture, it is now at a critical crossroads. Ambassador Troy Fitrell acknowledged that a renewed AGOA must reflect the realities of the modern global economy, not the context of the early 2000s when it was first enacted. Many African stakeholders and U.S. policymakers alike are pushing for reform in several key areas. 1. Longer-term authorization. African leaders and investors have repeatedly called for longer renewal cycles, ideally 15 to 20 years, to provide predictability and attract sustainable investment. The current short-term renewals every few years deter long-term planning and limit infrastructure development linked to export growth. 2. Expansion beyond goods to services and digital trade. As Africa's digital economy expands, projected to reach $712 billion by 2050, IFC and Google 2022, AGOA must evolve to include services, creative content, and digital trade provisions. This would empower African fintechs, artists, content creators, and e-commerce startups to access U.S. markets on a level playing field. 3. Incentives for value addition and regional trade. Current AGOA provisions often benefit raw exports rather than encouraging value chain integration and industrialization. Reforms could incentivize value addition by offering higher preferences for processed goods and regional content originating from AfCFTA-aligned countries. 4. Conditionalities that align with democratic development critics argue that AGOA's eligibility criteria, linked to governance and human rights, have sometimes been applied inconsistently or used as political leverage. While democratic principles must remain central, a more transparent and predictable criteria application is needed to avoid abrupt suspensions that harm ordinary workers more than governments. AfCFTA, a continental game changer or a missed opportunity for U.S. engagement. While Washington focuses on bilateral and sub-regional trade opportunities, Africa itself is undertaking its most ambitious integration effort in modern history, the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. With 54 signatories and a projected market of 1.4 billion people, AfCFTA aims to create a single African market by eliminating tariffs on 90% of goods and facilitating trade in services, labor, and capital. However, the U.S. has been notably quiet on how it plans to engage with or support AfCFTA. If the U.S. strategy remains solely bilateral, it risks undermining African unity by favoring individual countries over regional blocs, missing economies of scale that Pan-African integration provides, creating competing regulatory frameworks that fragment supply chains. Instead, the U.S. should position itself as a strategic partner to AfCFTA, offering technical assistance on trade facilitation, supporting regional infrastructure, and aligning its commercial diplomacy to reinforce rather than disrupt Africa's internal trade vision. Elections and political risk, the uncertain road ahead. Just as the U.S. commercial diplomacy strategy is gaining traction, two electoral cycles are poised to disrupt or redefine it: the 2025 U.S. presidential elections and a wave of African elections in countries like Nigeria, state level, Ghana, 2024-2025, Senegal, and the DRC. In the U.S., continuity depends heavily on bipartisan consensus around Africa policy. While recent administrations have echoed support for economic engagement, shifts in tone, from Obama's Power Africa to Trump's Prosper Africa to Biden's Global Infrastructure Partnership, reveal how fragile these priorities can be. In Africa, elections are expected to shift national development strategies, with some incumbents favoring statist economic models while others embrace market liberalism. These variations will affect how U.S. businesses navigate local contexts and whether reforms demanded under commercial diplomacy will be implemented or resisted. Furthermore, rising political instability, evident in the Sahel's wave of military takeovers, tensions in Sudan, and recurring electoral disputes, could threaten commercial investments unless paired with robust risk mitigation frameworks, including political risk insurance and conflict sensitive business planning. The next frontier: youth, innovation, and shared prosperity. If the U.S. is to truly reframe its engagement with Africa, it must anchor its commercial diplomacy in the continent's future, its youth. By 2030, young Africans will make up 42% of the global youth population. Harnessing this demographic dividend requires more than jobs. It demands inclusion in policy, capital access, and a stake in innovation ecosystems. What does this mean for U.S. policy? Youth-focused entrepreneurship funds that match local capital exchange programs that embed commercial diplomacy in education mentorship pipelines linking African youth to U.S. industries. Tech hubs and green incubators co-funded by public-private U.S. Africa partnerships. In this vision, commercial diplomacy becomes more than deal-making. It becomes development diplomacy, driven by shared values and mutual growth. Case studies: U.S. Africa commercial projects in motion. To understand the real-world implications of America's pivot to commercial diplomacy, it is essential to examine the projects already underway, those that may serve as models or cautionary tales. These cases illustrate both the potential and complexity of U.S. investment in Africa under the new strategy. The Lobito Corridor: strategic infrastructure with strategic intent. Arguably the flagship of this new engagement, the Lobito Corridor project is a multi-billion-dollar transnational railway and logistics network designed to link Angola's Atlantic port of Lobito with Zambia and the mineral-rich Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The corridor is meant to facilitate the export of copper, cobalt, and other critical minerals, vital for the global clean energy transition. Backed by the U.S., the European Union, and private financiers, the Lobito Corridor is not just about transportation. It's about geopolitics, supply chain security, and a strategic counterweight to China's Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in the critical minerals domain. But challenges abound. Local concerns about environmental impact and displacement remain unresolved. The long timeline for completion raises doubts about sustained political and financial commitment. If procurement and labor primarily benefit foreign entities, local development dividends may be limited, undermining the shared prosperity narrative. Still, if successfully implemented with inclusive governance and transparent contracting, Lobito could serve as a blueprint for future U.S.-Africa infrastructure cooperation. Power Africa and the mini-grid revolution in Nigeria and Kenya. Launched under the Obama administration, Power Africa has evolved into a multifaceted initiative supporting energy access through grid expansion, renewable power generation, and private investment. In Nigeria, the initiative has contributed to the rise of solar mini-grid providers like Husk Power and PowerGen, which now serve off-grid rural communities. In Kenya, Power Africa has supported geothermal development through partnerships with the Kenyan government connections to local solar IPPs, independent power producers, access to capital for clean energy entrepreneurs through US-backed DFIs, development finance institutions. However, commercial viability remains fragile. Projects often face delays due to bureaucratic hurdles or political interference, currency risk for investors, uneven enforcement of power purchase agreements. To scale these solutions, the U.S. will need to deepen partnerships with local banks, regulators, and technology providers while creating risk guarantees to protect investors in volatile markets. Côte d'Ivoire and U.S. corporate inroads in Francophone Africa. The establishment of U.S. commercial offices in Abidjan has been hailed as a breakthrough in American engagement with Francophone West Africa, a region long dominated by European influence. Ambassador Jessica Davis, BA, confirmed the presence of French-speaking personnel from the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and the U.S. Department of Commerce to identify new business opportunities. American companies have begun expanding into cocoa processing and agricultural value chains, port modernization projects, fintech solutions tailored for Francophone SMEs. The region remains underpenetrated by U.S. firms, but it also represents a high risk, high reward market. Political instability in neighboring Sahelian states like Burkina Faso and Mali, as well as fluctuating CFA franc monetary policies, complicate long-term business forecasts. Risks of neocolonial market capture, a rising concern. While Washington emphasizes equal partnerships, some African analysts and civil society groups are expressing growing skepticism over what they see as a rebranded economic dominance strategy. The commercial diplomacy model, critics argue, could unintentionally replicate neocolonial patterns if U.S. firms monopolize strategic sectors, e.g., energy, data, critical minerals. Investment favors elite-connected businesses, excluding grassroots entrepreneurs. Infrastructure projects serve extractive purposes without building local capacity. Aid is withdrawn without adequate safety nets, pushing vulnerable communities into deeper precarity. The Pan-African Institute for Policy Research, PIPR, recently published a report warning that, without safeguards, commercial diplomacy can become corporate diplomacy, serving shareholder returns more than social transformation. To avoid this trap, the U.S. must ensure inclusive stakeholder consultations in project planning, prioritize local content requirements and skills transfers, fund independent impact assessments on social, gender, and environmental outcomes, partner with African-led development institutions such as the African Development Bank on joint financing and monitoring mechanisms. The role of African institutions, shaping or resisting the new paradigm. Africa is not a passive arena for foreign policy experiments. Regional institutions are actively responding to the U.S. commercial pivot with varying degrees of enthusiasm and caution. African Union, AU, advocating for harmonized engagement. The African Union has welcomed increased U.S. investment, but has emphasized the need for alignment with continental priorities, particularly the Agenda 2063 framework, which envisions integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. Continental infrastructure projects identified under PIDA, Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, support for AfCFTA implementation, especially in regulatory convergence and trade facilitation. The AU has also signaled the need for greater African voice in setting the agenda for the proposed 2025 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. We must move from donor-recipient optics to co-authorship of strategy, said AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Albert Muchanga. Chambers of commerce and business councils, local gatekeepers, national and regional business chambers are now at the center of U.S. commercial engagement. From the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, KEPSA, to the Nigeria American Chamber of Commerce, these entities are shaping investor sentiment, offering matchmaking platforms, and lobbying governments for pro-business reforms. Yet, their impact varies by country. In places with stronger institutions, they act as facilitators. In weaker contexts, they risk being gatekeepers that favor entrenched elites over innovative startups and marginalized groups. Voices from the ground, African entrepreneurs on the front lines of U.S. commercial diplomacy. While state-level policies and billion-dollar projects often make headlines, the real test of the U.S. commercial diplomacy shift lies at the grassroots, among African entrepreneurs navigating global trade, regulatory hurdles, and investment deserts. Their stories offer unfiltered insight into both the promises and pitfalls of the new investment led paradigm. Fatmata Jallow, agripreneur, Sierra Leone Fatmata, a young agri-tech entrepreneur based in Bo, Sierra Leone, runs a cassava processing startup that supplies flour to bakeries across West Africa. When asked about U.S. trade and investment, she voiced cautious optimism. "We don't need aid. We need access," she said. "Access to machines, access to affordable loans, access to markets. If the US can help me get my cassava flour into supermarkets in Atlanta or Chicago, that's the real empowerment." Yet Fatmata has struggled with meeting US food safety standards without technical support, navigating a fragmented certification process, finding US partners willing to co-invest in processing capacity in rural West Africa. Her story underscores a key challenge. Without targeted support mechanisms, the opportunities from commercial diplomacy may remain out of reach for most SMEs. Kwame Osei, fintech innovator, Ghana. Kwame leads a blockchain-based remittance startup that reduces transfer fees for diaspora communities sending money to Ghana. He sees U.S. commercial diplomacy as a potential springboard, especially if policies connect African tech startups with Silicon Valley venture capital and talent. "We have the code. We just need capital and partnerships," he explained. But U.S. investors still don't see Africa as investable. They see it as charitable. Despite accolades, his startup has faced visa denials for U.S. pitch competitions, limited exposure in U.S. trade missions focused on legacy sectors, no access to U.S. government backed tech accelerators. Kwame believes a diaspora tech bridge, linking African American VCs with African entrepreneurs, could transform the landscape. Trade and industrialization, friends or foes. Africa's path to structural transformation requires more than exports. It requires industrialization. Historically, countries that have transitioned from low income to middle income status have done so by moving up the value chain, from raw materials to finished products. Critics worry that the U.S. trade policy, as currently structured, still incentivizes raw exports over processing, undermining Africa's industrial ambitions. For instance, AGOA permits the export of raw cotton, but offers less competitive terms for finished garments. U.S. investments in mining often focus on extraction rather than local beneficiation or refining capacity. American food corporations source cocoa from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, but manufacture chocolates in Europe or the U.S. To align trade with transformation, the U.S. must prioritize value addition in AGOA 2.0 and all bilateral trade agreements. Support African governments in building industrial parks, SEZs, special economic zones, and manufacturing clusters. Fund vocational training programs aligned with U.S. backed industries. Collaborate on regional value chains that allow multiple African countries to participate in production processes. This will require moving beyond the America First export model to embrace a co-production and skills transfer strategy, one that sees African industrial growth as complementary to U.S. commercial interests, not competitive. The role of U.S. states and subnational diplomacy. An underreported but increasingly relevant trend in U.S. Africa relations is the rise of subnational diplomacy. U.S. states, especially those with strong diaspora populations or export oriented economies, are forging independent commercial relationships with African countries. Texas Nigeria, Economic Corridor Texas, with its massive oil and gas sector and significant Nigerian diaspora, has initiated energy and real estate investment deals with Lagos State. Houston based firms are also exploring partnerships in agricultural mechanization and rural electrification. Georgia Ghana Trade Alliance. Georgia's Department of Economic Development has signed MOUs with Ghanaian trade agencies focusing on logistics, fintech, and film industry collaboration. Atlanta, often dubbed the Black Mecca, is increasingly viewed as a gateway for diaspora driven commercial engagement. California East Africa Innovation Bridge, California's tech ecosystem, paired with the robust East African developer scene in Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia, is catalyzing partnerships in edtech, health tech, and climate resilience. Several African startups have joined Y Combinator, signaling growing Silicon Valley interest. These state level efforts operate with less political red tape than federal diplomacy, are more agile in responding to business needs, can serve as test beds for broader federal initiatives, offer diaspora communities a direct channel to contribute economically. The federal government would do well to support and amplify these initiatives, perhaps through a national subnational Africa engagement framework that coordinates city to city and state to state ties in line with national strategic objectives. Strategic response: how African governments can maximize gains from U.S. commercial diplomacy. As the United States deepens its investment led engagement with Africa, the onus is now on African governments to respond with strategic alignment, proactive governance, and a clear national interest lens. The risk of entering lopsided partnerships is real if policy responses are passive or reactionary. 1. Define clear national investment frameworks. African countries must articulate their national development priorities and ensure that incoming U.S. investments align with them. Whether it's building agro-processing zones, supporting renewable energy, or upgrading health infrastructure, investment must flow where it adds long-term value, not just short-term profit. This requires transparent procurement systems, national investment charters that emphasize local content and technology transfer, performance-based incentives tied to job creation and skills development. 2. Negotiate from a position of strength. Commercial diplomacy is not charity, it's business. African leaders must build regional negotiating blocks, e.g., ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, to set collective red lines and attract regional investments. Train investment and trade negotiators who understand U.S. commercial law, contract structures, and arbitration systems. Leverage institutions like the African Trade Observatory to understand market trends and pricing mechanisms. In a multipolar world, Africa has options. The U.S. needs African markets and minerals just as much as Africa needs investment. Mutual dependence should translate into mutual respect. 3. Invest in domestic capacity and absorptive infrastructure. Even the best external investments can fail if met with poor roads, unreliable power, and a weak banking system. Governments must prioritize public investment in foundational infrastructure, education reforms to align graduates with industrial needs, strengthening of regulatory institutions to uphold environmental and labor standards. African countries that have succeeded in transforming external investments into inclusive growth, such as Rwanda, Botswana, and Mauritius, did so by building internal systems that harness global capital for national development. Final thoughts, advice to African leaders. As Africa stands on the edge of a new chapter in its relationship with the United States, African leaders must rise with clarity, courage, and conviction. This era of commercial diplomacy must not become a rebranded extractive relationship, nor should it be accepted uncritically. Here's what must be done. Lead with vision. Know what your country wants before accepting what is offered. Empower your people. Ensure deals benefit the masses, not the elite few. Negotiate smartly. Don't be seduced by handshakes and headlines. Scrutinize the fine print. Champion regionalism. Unity is bargaining power. AfCFTA must be more than a slogan. Insist on mutual accountability. If U.S. ambassadors are rated by the number of deals they secure, African leaders must be rated by how well those deals serve national interests. Summary of key messages. 1. U.S. commercial diplomacy marks a decisive shift from aid dependency to investment-driven engagement, with a six-pronged strategy led by trade, private sector advocacy, and infrastructure. 2. African SMEs, youth innovators, and industrial sectors stand to benefit, but only if supported with inclusive policies, de-risking tools, and access to U.S. markets. 3. AGOA reform and AfCFTA alignment are essential to ensuring that trade preferences promote value addition and regional integration. 4. The African diaspora and U.S. States are emerging as critical players in reshaping bilateral and subnational relationships with Africa. 5. Commercial diplomacy must not reproduce neocolonial patterns. African governments and institutions must proactively shape engagement to prioritize sustainability, equity, and national sovereignty. The Bold African Voice, BAV, will continue to monitor, analyze, and advocate for Africa's rightful place in the evolving global trade architecture. This is more than policy. It is the story of a continent demanding to be seen, heard, and respected. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, where we don't just report Africa's stories, we shape them. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. Together, let's demand a future where Africa is not just a partner, but a power player on the world stage.